Today we'll take a look at biogeochemical cycles. The law of conservation of mass states that mass cannot be created or destroyed. In fact, matter cycles in and out of an ecosystem. It goes through a cycle, like a circle. A biogeochemical cycle is a really long word, but it stands for something. The word part bio, of course, means life. Geo means earth. So a biogeochemical cycle is the movement of a particular chemical through the biological and geological parts of an ecosystem. You can compare this to the last section where we were discussing energy, and we said energy doesn't cycle in an ecosystem, it goes in one direction. If you remember, energy starts in the sun, moves into the producers, then the consumers, the decomposers, and eventually the energy is lost as heat. It goes in one direction. It's not destroyed, but it goes in one direction, whereas matter cycles. The first cycle is the water cycle. It's also known as the hydrologic cycle. This is one that you're probably very familiar with. You've probably talked about this since elementary school. But first, we're going to discuss the importance of water. Organisms need water to carry nutrients, to get rid of waste, and to run their chemical reactions. Cells are made up mostly of water, as are you. So it's a very, very important chemical. The water enters the atmosphere in the following ways. One is evaporation. Water is heated by the sun, and it enters the atmosphere. Turns into water vapor and rises. Transpiration is like water evaporation, but it's evaporation from the leaves of trees and plants. Once it's in the atmosphere, the water condenses through condensation. The water vapor turns back into liquid, and it begins to accumulate in clouds. When the clouds are too heavy, the water falls to the earth as rain, snow, sleet, or hail. These are forms of precipitation. So here is the water cycle. You can see evaporation occurring off the surface of the ocean, transpiration happening off the surface of plants. The water condenses back into back from water vapor into liquid water. And then when the water gets too heavy and the clouds get too heavy, precipitation occurs in the form of rain in this case. The water runs off, it seeps into the soil, it enters the lake and groundwater, and it finds its way back into the ocean. The second cycle we're going to discuss is the carbon cycle. So why is carbon important? Turns out that carbon is the basic building block of all living things. In fact, living things are carbon-based. We say they are carbon-based or organic. They contain carbon atoms at their center. So carbon is really important if we're going to build cells and we're going to get energy. So we definitely need that carbon. How do we get it? How does it move through the ecosystem? Well, here are some steps. Since it's a cycle, it doesn't really have a beginning, but we're going to start somewhere. And where we start is going to be the atmosphere, in the air. In the atmosphere, carbon is in a form known as CO2 or carbon dioxide. And nothing can really use that CO2. We can't get the carbon out of it, but plants can. Plants take the carbon dioxide in through photosynthesis. They also need water, and they conduct photosynthesis to make carbohydrates, and the carbohydrate that they make is sugar. Once plants have made this sugar, consumers can consume the plants, and then they will get the carbohydrate, and they will get the sugar. So it's going to move through the food web. Here it is, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. During photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide is used to make sugar. That sugar enters the food web, and it moves to the consumers. Next, what happens is we eat the sugar, for example, and plants also need to use the sugar. But what we have to do with that sugar is break it apart to release the energy that's inside. And we do that through cellular respiration. During cellular respiration, we break down carbohydrates. We get the energy out of it. We use the energy to do work, to think, to walk around, to move. And then we generate a waste product. And that waste product is CO2. To us, CO2 is waste. It's toxic. And we breathe out carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide we breathe out ends back up in the atmosphere. Decomposers also release CO2. When they break down dead plants and animals, they release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And the third way we're going to discuss is the combustion of fossil fuels. When we burn things like coal in our factories here in New Jersey, or gasoline in our cars, or natural gas in our houses, what happens is we release a ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this is actually a problem because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so it's actually able to absorb large amounts of energy and cause our planet to have an increase in temperature in what is known as global climate change. So we ended up last time here with the animals, right? And they're going to break apart the sugar through cellular respiration, where they're going to release the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Here's some human activity. This looks like a factory. It's probably burning coal, and that gets released back into the atmosphere. Volcanoes also release carbon dioxide back into the air. And then here you can see the same thing happening in the ocean, in an ocean ecosystem. The third cycle is the nitrogen cycle. So what is the importance of nitrogen? It's used by organisms to make proteins. Okay, proteins are needed to build cells and to help with chemical reactions. They're super important. The atmosphere is actually 78% nitrogen, right? So most of the air around you is nitrogen, but there's a problem. We can't use this form. It's useless to us. We breathe it in, we breathe it back out. It's in this form known as N2. So normally at this point, we would count on plants to do something with that nitrogen, make it usable, but plants can't use the nitrogen either. So we need to rely on somebody else. And that somebody else is these guys, these soil bacteria. They're nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They do something known as nitrogen fixation, where they turn that nitrogen gas into things like ammonia, for example, nitrates and nitrites, which are usable forms of nitrogen. These type of bacteria live in the soil, and they live on the roots of these things known as legumes or legumes. What are they? They include chickpeas, kidney beans, peas, peanuts, soy. These are all kinds of legumes. And on their roots, you can see here are these nodes, these nodules, and in them live these colonies of bacteria that are doing this nitrogen fixation. Here's another picture. You can see here's the legume. It's got these nodes, and in it are these beautiful soil bacteria that are performing nitrogen fixation, changing nitrogen gas into a much more usable form. Okay, N2 in the atmosphere, right? And here it's being taken up by these bacteria at the root of the legumes, and the bacteria, here are the bacteria, they're performing nitrogen fixation, changing nitrogen into other much more usable forms, as you can see here. Once the bacteria is in a much more useful form, plants absorb the nitrogen from the soil, and then it's in the food web. Animals eat the plants and they get the nitrogen, and it moves through the food web. Nitrogen returns to the soil when organisms are decomposed by decomposers. Okay, so eventually the nitrogen is going to end back up when organisms are decomposed. It's going to end up back in the air as nitrogen. And the last cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is needed for ATP, which is your energy currency, and then DNA, which has all of your genetic information. Phosphorus is found in soil and rocks as calcium phosphate. It's the only one that doesn't actually enter the atmosphere. So water enters the atmosphere as water vapor. Carbon enters the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Nitrogen enters the atmosphere as N2. Phosphorus does not enter the atmosphere. Instead, it dissolves in water and it forms phosphate, and that phosphate leaches into the groundwater. Once the phosphate is in the groundwater, plants get the phosphate. Here's a cute little plant, and then it goes up the food chain. Animals get the phosphate when they feed on the item that's below them. How does it get back into the soil? Again, decomposers break apart dead things and they return the phosphorus to the soil, thus continuing the phosphorus cycle. Mining and agriculture also release phosphorus into the environment, and sometimes that can be too much of a good thing, and it can cause different types of problems like algal blooms. Here is the phosphorus cycle, another image. Here it's happening on land, and here it's happening in the ocean. So those were the biogeochemical cycles of water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. I hope that was helpful.